So, like I said, it's great to see everyone today. I'm excited to talk about this topic. As usual, we're going to go through some slides that I always share, just that have some great resources and action items. And I am going to share just some of the research I've done on this topic. But I wanted to start out by just sharing, since some of you may or may not know each other, how, our name, what we do, or what organization we're with, but then how are you using AI currently, or are you? And if there's anybody who wants to dive in, feel free to just unmute.
I'm Rachel Johnson. I'm from Virginia's New River Valley. We're an economic development organization that markets the area as a great place to work and live and do business. I currently use AI for blog posts, just writing and getting information out there to kind of speed up the process a little bit. That's basically the max that I use it for. Of course, some of these more sophisticated AI components cost money these days. And so just kind of looking at options and ways that we can utilize it in a way that's beneficial.
Oh, we might have lost Rachel there. Awesome. I think we lost just that last sentence, Rachel. So, if there's anything you wanted to final add at the end there.
Yeah, so just looking for ways to use AI as a benefit for the region and for our investors.
Yeah, awesome. Dean or Alex?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dean. I'm from Touchstone Center for Crafts, which is in southwestern Pennsylvania. I am the marketing director here. This week, I'm taking a blacksmithing workshop, so took a little break. I do have to leave at 12:30, so just wanted to disclose. I think I was pretty much an early adopter with AI. I was teaching journalism at Carlow University, and I was teaching the students how to use it responsibly. And in my role at Touchstone, I use it almost every day to write content for social media or tweak my content for social media. Most of the time, I give it the information and ask it to just make me not look like a fool, you know? One of the times it comes in most handy is coming up where we are working on our catalog information and rewriting all that content, not only so it all sounds in the same voice, but also is engaging to our participants. So yeah, that's about how I use it. So
Awesome, thanks.
Hey, my name's Al Letizia. I'm with the city of Asheville, and I work in their IT department, and currently mostly using AI to kind of walk me through massive amounts of documentation and kind of put some of that documentation into the AI of choice and give me sort of a bullet point of how to do what I'm trying to do. Usually configuring something in some application or something like that. But also we're sort of working on developing programs to help teach employees how to use AI too. So there's kind of that aspect of it as well. I don't really do much content creation, so I know that that's like sort of one of the big use cases for it. But we're sort of helping people navigate how to use it, and I'm using it also to go through lots of documentation and stuff.
Thank you so much. No, I love that because it's, it shows the many layers of this stuff, all the different things that it can do is pretty amazing. And I see Cade's on the line. If you can't come on camera, that's fine, Cade, but if you can unmute and you just want to share your name and where you're coming from and then how you're using AI currently.
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
if you are.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name's Cade. You see him pronouns. I'm based out of Omaha, Nebraska, but I work remotely for a company called Exegy, who works in the affordable housing space. Specifically, I work for the city of San Francisco as a software engineer. I'm probably a AI critic, skeptic, more so than an AI user. I have dabbled with using Google or GitHub Copilot during my software engineering to like help kind of explain like what different blocks of code mean, and I have had some success with that. I have developed like some vision recognition stuff in years ago. But I'm really excited for this conversation because I just have read and done a couple presentations at work about the book Atlas of AI, which talks a lot about the environmental impacts as well as the labor impacts of artificial intelligence and that whole supply chain. So yeah, excited to be here.
Thanks so much. So as usual, I'm Sarah Benoit. I'm with the JB Media Institute. And essentially, I have been doing digital marketing for over 20 years. I've also been building websites and optimizing websites. So even though AI is a bigger public conversation right now, it's always been a part of the algorithms. So I've been studying it and, similar to Dean, kind of early adopting, like dabbling in things and talking to people about it. So this sort of new world that we're living in where everyone's talking about it and everything has started to really evolve super quickly. I really designed the leadership roundtable so that we could have discussions, share ideas, and just talk to each other about where we're at and what we're experiencing. So if anybody's newer to this, I just want to invite you to jump in, interrupt me. Like I said, I'm going to share some research. I'll send those slides out afterwards, along with a recording that'll go to everybody who is registered. But I want us today, just between now and 1 o'clock, to feel, well, might not be 1 o'clock your time, but 1 o'clock Eastern, the next 50 minutes, just to feel comfortable sharing your expertise, because I think everybody's got their own experiences. And that's like the value of actually coming together, is to kind of hear what other people are working on. Just since you brought it up, Kate, I'm curious, and then anybody else can jump in after this. What have you learned so far about the environmental impacts of AI? Can you just share some of the highlights of what you've been reading and studying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the things that really have stuck out to me is with like large language models like ChatGPT, just the carbon emissions that is required the carbon emissions that happens by the training of these models is something along the lines of same amount of a lifetime of 5 commercial vehicles. Every time you use ChatGPT, for like every 50 prompts is the equivalent to dumping 5 glasses of water down the drain. So it's not just carbon emissions. There's a lot of water impacts, especially in areas where water is quite scarce. Large data centers are kind of like taking up a lot of that water needs. There's also, of course, the problem of mineral extraction with lithium and for electric batteries, but also just like any type of computing is going to require those rare earth metals. And then, yeah, just like how absolutely massive and how quickly growing this industry is, it makes me think of the airline industry, right? Where like, in fact, like I believe the tech industry is surpassing the airline industry in global emissions. But yeah, it just makes me think of like, oh wow, like usually I blame corporations for climate change, right? Because they do the most. But it's like, oh shit, like my individual kind of choices do kind of put a little bit of an impact here because of just how big the carbon emissions are. So
Anybody else have anything they've learned or talked about before? Just curious if this has come up in conversation for any of you.
Kind of along what Cade was talking about. I haven't researched it myself, but there's been a lot of conversations even among my friends about the data centers and the materials that it takes to maintain all of this computer programming and data centers and all that takes from the environment in general.
I'll be honest, it's really kind of mind-blowing. And also is just something I never thought about.
Yeah, I'll just say that for me, I think one of the things that inspired me at the end of last year to do this series was essentially I had some colleagues that went to a conference that was on, like socially conscious business, and my business partner's agency is B Corp certified, so it was a lot of B Corps coming together nationally, and they gave a stat that OpenAI as a company has already surpassed the entire airline industry as far as carbon emissions. And so that felt really intense when they came back saying that, right? Like that in this short amount of time that OpenAI has existed, that it's like already surpassing some of the most sort of uh, largest industries that drive carbon emissions. And so, that's where I suddenly became like, I am not thinking about this. I'm scared about other things. I need to dive into the whole bigger picture here of what we're dealing with. So that's like really why I wanted to bring this to the table. So I want to be clear on a couple things. One, the tech industry, we were already environmentally failing, right? So that's hard to say because I've been in the tech industry for so long. But the truth is, we've already been failing. Like our smartphones it's not sustainable. It's not really great how we handle things, right? Especially the way that things get applied differently in different countries based on different rules and what's allowed. The data centers themselves with their water usage, that has been an issue for a long time. Especially in the world of social media, things, companies like Meta. I've been reading about those issues for a long time. So I do want to say too, it's not necessarily like this issue's just like come up out of nowhere. We can't necessarily like, we blame AI for this situation. We're kind of already in this situation where a lot of our technology, the way that we're handling it is just, really looking at how to spend the least amount of money, and that becomes problematic, I think, across the board. And so really what's happened, I think, with AI is we're layering on top of problems that already existed, but those problems are growing exponentially, essentially, right? Because AI is moving so quickly, and the amount of evolution we're seeing as far as the tools are concerned is just so big. So I always like to start with this because especially as we go into the end of the year, the last few topics that I have on the list for the series is they're big topics. They're not things that we're going to solve. I'm not even sure that I think at the end of these conversations, we could walk away being like, oh, I feel so much better. I think we really just have to be okay with the fact that there's not a lot of answers quite yet, and that we're still figuring it out. And that actually we've been in that process of figuring it out for a long time. And that's why I think when it comes to leadership, all of the different ways that we have leadership in our organizations, we just have to be people who can actually bring these conversations to the table. We have to be willing to sometimes talk about them or ask questions about how we're investing our money, especially when we do get to the point where we're paying for tools. So, I always want us to be entering these conversations with, we can't solve the problem. It is super huge. It does feel overwhelming. But it's not brand new. People have been working on it for a long time. There are actually ways to get involved, both personally and professionally. And there are ways that we can just be people who are curious and care about our communities and care about the bigger picture of how this stuff impacts the world. And so we can just be that voice in the room, whatever rooms we're in. And I think that really matters, no matter what small impact we're making. It really matters. So you all really already touched on this, but what's the problem? The environmental effects of AI have significant implications at the local and regional levels. That also turns into national and global issues, but it's like literally where the data centers are located makes a big difference, and there's a big issue of equity there. And that's more around, we have to be cautious that we build data centers in places that are very natural and open and maybe don't have as many people, but then what kind of resources are there and how are we taxing those resources? Right. So, that's been, again, a long-term question. The AI situation is really increasing our need to talk about this question. We kind of already touched on the fact that it's just literally the large models and their deep neural networks, they're very energy intensive. And we talked about this during the privacy and security session as well, because we were talking about how these models are also like data hungry. And so that creates a bunch of issues. And so, in order for them to function, we have to keep feeding them data. And so I see like this connection in a lot of the different conversations we've had around how just there's this like huge resource demand from what we're building. And so we need to be kind of really thinking about that as we're in the process, rather than kind of building this whole world and then being like, oops, this isn't really sustainable. And it's really taxing the resources of local towns and cities, local regions. It's really taxing the natural resources of different countries, and things like that. But the positive is, like I said, because it's not a new conversation, there's been these very promising steps towards making things more sustainable. And I think what we as leaders need to start thinking about is there's some typical things that we look at, like carbon emissions and water consumption, which were like the easiest and quickest things to use as examples and measure. But there's also like these even more, like it's sort of like those two things are buckets. And then inside of there are these like sub buckets. And inside of some of those buckets are sub buckets. And so that's where, I think we can deepen the conversation and ask more questions about this. I think local environmental concerns and costs, we also we've already talked about sort of the toll of chip manufacturing. If you're not familiar with that, it's really, especially with smartphones, and all sorts of computers, you have to manufacture the chips, like Cade said, and that's taking, precious minerals. And those things are mined all over the world in different ways. And that's why I'm saying, like, this is almost like an extension of that issue in some ways. But the biggest things we're seeing is these megawatt hours of electricity. They emit huge amounts of carbon, right? And so, that training process in and of itself is kind of it's making a demand on the resources or on even the grid potentially that we have, depending on how it's supported. And then the freshwater issue, right? So using freshwater to really cool the data centers, which has been going on for a long time as well. That's not a new thing. Facebook and Google especially were doing that way early on in the game. But it's like, again, we have these whole areas of our country where freshwater is really dying out. We have whole huge rivers that support, whole regions of the United States, and we're seeing those resources deplete. When it comes to electrical generation, what I thought was interesting is there's problems obviously with kind of our old way of doing it through fossil fuels, because that contributes to all sorts of other pollution and issues that we have going on. But there's even a lot of questions around when we use things like solar and things like that. Again, we want to be really thoughtful about how we build the data centers and use that type of thing, again, so we don't put different types of pressure on different systems. And a lot of times when we build these types of data centers in different places, that pollution directly impacts the community that lives there. Or if it's in a natural area, it's directly impacting that part of nature, pretty clearly. And so that's where, on a local level, there's already individual places that are saying this is problematic. Right. In the US, the AI demand, because we're also lucky to have such access to so many different things here from a digital perspective. And I don't think some people realize sometimes that not everywhere in the world just has like Wi-Fi in every nook and cranny of everything. Like that's actually pretty American in some ways, that we just have Wi-Fi everywhere. So we can access this type of stuff just from so many different places. And so it's already becoming like a key portion of our energy consumption and electricity usage. And by, another 2 years from now, they're really looking at, okay, what are we going to do if this starts to put stress on our infrastructures? So we've all heard the stories of things like what happened in Texas, where, an unexpected thing happens and it puts stress on the grid, right? They have extreme heat or extreme cold, or maybe they have both of those things in a year, and their system hasn't been able to handle that pressure. So their grid goes down, right? And you end up with people that have no electricity, therefore no cooling systems when it's 120 degrees or something of that nature, right? So we've seen examples of that in all sorts of parts of the country. And we want to make sure that AI, how we're building our infrastructure on this level, doesn't actually add to that problem because those problems are actually pretty intense already, right? So we have kind of a very big urgency around that. And then, like I said, all of those local, regional things, they obviously impact the national perspective. But then almost every country in the world that's, on this kind of like AI race to the top, they're essentially all seeing similar concerns and costs. And there's questions that they don't know how to answer. So it's, there's kind of this bigger picture of like, we all actually need to help each other because kind of everybody's just flying by the seat of their pants, I feel. Even though, again, these tools have been around, this technology's been around, we've been watching it evolve at least 22 years of my career. We have to just be really thoughtful because there's so many things that come up as we're doing this that nobody seems to have like a clarity exactly around how we mitigate certain circumstances. Um, one piece of data that I thought was pretty crazy is this one at the top, that when it comes to the environmental impacts and how they're escalating right now, and the global AI energy demand, it's projected that it's going to increase to at least 10 times the current level and will exceed the annual electricity consumption of entire countries that are smaller, like Belgium, in the next couple of years. So to me, that's like pretty, again, like mind blowing. It's like, okay, so the infrastructure we're building for AI right now, it's going to be making demands that are 10 times what they are now in 2 years. They'll like our own AI companies will require more resources than an entire country. And again, the US, I think sometimes we forget, not all the countries are as big as us. A bunch are, a handful are, but many, many countries, if we have corporations that are using the resources that could support access to things for whole countries, we really have to make good decisions about that. And I think one of the biggest arguments that I'm kind of trying to be a part of right now is that we have to figure out how we're going to policy wise regulate this type of thing. And I have a feeling it's going to be in the long run, we're probably not going to do it globally to start, but I sort of see that there's a purpose in why we would actually globally look at this, and have countries come together and talk about how we set real standards. And again, this isn't anything different than what's been going on with the environmental situation thus far. We just haven't moved the dial that far yet in that global perspective, right? We have a little bit of action there, but overall, everybody's kind of doing it on their own. I really see AI as going to be another reason why we have to talk about how we come together and make decisions together so that we can protect, everybody's interests, every community, so that we can make sure people are really taken care of. When we think about this kind of stuff, especially the demand on fresh water, it comes into all these different places that are experiencing extreme heat and drought right now. Right. So we're going to find that a state like Arizona has the same problems as a country like Chile because they're experiencing some of the same stress on their resources all together. And then AI building in those areas starts to actually worsen that or prolong those situations, right? So it makes drought worse. It makes water more scarce. And that's where I think a lot of environmentalists have been, kind of beating a drum on this topic, as things like OpenAI do so well and their tools get so popular. And again, it's never to say that those tools aren't valuable because they are, but I think, one of my big sort of TED Talk soapboxes is that I don't want us to do the same thing we keep doing with tech, which is kind of focusing on profit first and then 10 to 20 years later being like, oh my gosh, we have these serious problems that we didn't address. I'd really like to see us globally say we have to address these as it happens. So as we're learning, we need to be paying attention to what we're learning and we need to be adjusting how we're doing things. And so I see that we need policy that encourages companies to do that. Right. Another part of, I think, what goes on in this sort of more global environmental kind of piece is a lot of the big tech companies, they have data centers all over the world. They're building infrastructure everywhere. Meta is certainly doing that. Google is certainly doing that. And they have been for decades. And what we really want to be careful of is like, if you look at this slide, when Google operates in one country, it's extremely responsible. And then it operates in other countries and it doesn't have to. So it doesn't. And I think that's the issue of this global conversation. How do we make sure that we stop that sort of experience, right? Where, any large kind of developing AI is able to say, well, they're not going to restrict me as much over here. So I'm going to move all my operations there, or I'm going to build more data centers there, because I know that I can be a little bit more abusive. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that Google's in Finland and they're 97% carbon free. And then you get into where they're located in Asia and it drops to as low as 4%. Right? Like, so again, I understand this is just capitalism and business where we again focus on profit, how we make the most money, how we reduce cost. But I think, one of the things that environmentally we have to start considering is that has not worked and it is not going to work. I don't see any part of the future until we actually really change deeply our policies across the board. I just don't see how that approach to things is actually going to benefit the vast majority of people, right? There's going to be some countries that hold higher standards. They're going to benefit from it, but there's going to be a lot of places that really, really don't. And I think in the US, we're going to see that in a state by state perspective as well, right? So in the United States, there are some states that tax more, they do more around the environment. They benefit from certain things. And then you see other states that don't invest in that and they have typically more problems when it comes to what happens when you have an environmental issue, right? A real disaster, or the pollution gets to a point where it's actually harming people in a town, or it's actually really, truly harming a resource that more metro areas actually need to have access to. So for me, a lot of this is, I link in the slides to this great Harvard Business Review article that I think did a great job of taking a really heady topic and kind of boiling it down to just these sort of, like I said, like local, national, global pieces and connecting them together. There's also some great work being done around this, right? So you can look at the AI Now Institute's 2023 landscape report and kind of see what they're charting. UNESCO has been charting this out and giving lots of suggestions. The state of California, which I feel in our country is always trying to take a leadership role when it comes to environmental issues. They're putting out benefits and risks of generative artificial intelligence reports. And so again, there's ways that you can sort of join the conversation here, like on all these levels, I feel. And if you're in a local community that's directly impacted by some of this stuff, there's certainly local conversations happening in a lot of different ways that you can find. And so to me, it's really about how can we, again, support the people asking these questions, connect with the organizations that are driving some of these reports, pass these reports around and ask and share them and invite discussions about them and think about how that relates to whatever we're doing. And so I think for me, living in rural America, that's something that, I see maybe like Western North Carolina isn't suffering from this particular issue, but I can see how we really care about our natural outdoor spaces here. It's a huge part of our economy and why people love living here. And so every time businesses tried to move into our region, there's that question of what impact is it going to have on our smaller towns and cities and the taxes, but also like our natural experience and this beautiful place that we live. So when I see other communities out west already having these issues, I really relate to it, even if it's not exactly happening to us. And that's a great place, I feel, for me personally, to plug into the conversation because I understand it. I've seen it happen in different ways. And I think we have to be preparing. Regardless of whether it's happening to us right now. So just to give a good example for Western North Carolina, we've already had issues here because we have great fresh water, some of the best fresh water in the country happening here in Western North Carolina. And just the influx of breweries into our region put a tax on the amount of fresh water that we have here, right? So it takes a lot of water to make beer, and we have a lot of breweries making beer. And some of them are taking our water and shipping it out to other places, right? And so that's a good example of how I see AI relates to these other kind of environmental questions that we're asking. So there's so many places where you can plug into that. I've also put together some slides that are just around like, so what can we do? What is actually happening? This link right here under Google, this little comment about Google, I will give Google some credit. They have actually spent a lot of time sharing their environmental impact. They're not perfect. Nobody is perfect. Like I said, they're a company, they're a business. I think there's some places they're doing really well and some places they're taking advantage of the situation. But I will give them some credit that it's all out there. You can find it. right? So if you click on this link, you can go read a whole report about their data centers. You can see updates that are happening regularly about how they're handling this. I think this is like a great first step. I think any company involved in any type of big tech, even if it's not AI, should be absolutely required um, to not just be like making an effort, but I mean, I think they should be required to make aggressive efforts towards sustainability, and that should be a completely transparent thing that they have to tell everybody about. I just think like out of all the regulations, that doesn't really impact your bottom line at all, in my opinion, but it means you have to tell the truth and you have to let people know what you're doing in their country, in their city, in their town, in their region, right? And a lot of this, like I said, has to do with just the data center power, their cooling infrastructures, and they have made strides. Again, if you look at these reports, we've dropped from 2.0 to 1.1 since 2016, right? When it comes to power usage effectiveness. So that's one of those ways that they're tracking things. And so again, we're moving the dial. I think the question is, are we moving it fast enough? Or are we moving it at least this, are we asking these questions and setting these policies and goals as quickly as we are building the infrastructure? We kind of need to bring those things together. I also think you'll see there's a lot of design options, right? So in the world where people are creating AI, they're designing different systems, they're using different algorithms. There is a whole approach already out there to designing with efficiency first, right? And again, not new. We've always had that. It's really, I think, having a holistic perspective on the systems and thinking about how, we just approach computing. I think we're going to see in the next few years, and I know a lot of people would say, well, we can't do this or we can't do that. I mean, I personally feel that our environment is actually just going to demand the paradigm shift at this point. So I'm not sure that I think we're going to go that long before we have to start addressing that paradigm shift, right? And I think that paradigm shift is exciting if we think about how technology can truly serve people, how it can change people's lives, how it can protect us, how it can help us solve problems. If we can really make that paradigm shift, and again, not just do it as one country over the long term, but bring other countries into that. It's like that's where I see a big change. And I will just say on a personal note, I don't know how many of you are readers of Einstein, but Einstein talked a lot about at the end of his life the one world government, which I know not everybody's comfortable with this concept, but I've read a lot about it because I was interested in his perspective. And sometimes when I'm reading about these things, I'm like, maybe it's not about one world government, like we have one master overlords or something, but maybe it's more about this idea that Einstein often talked about, which was that in order to keep going with technology advancements, we're going to have to create a more unified perspective to how we deploy these systems, right? There are already data center operators that are pursuing net zero emissions. I appreciate that a lot of them have focused in on water positive goals by 2030. So I think that's more realistic. We don't have them saying 2050, which to me always feels too late. And so just knowing that over the next 5 years to 6 years, there are really clear AI data center operators in many, many different companies that are being tasked with this. And I think as leaders, one of the things that I think we can all do without a huge amount of effort sometimes is before we spend money with a company, before we invest in a tool, before we take our, a kind of like actual hard cash and put it into something that we're using, that we really actually just ask the questions. Like, what are their sustainability goals? How are they managing their data centers? Is it transparent on their website? Is there a way to get that information? I'm being very cautious around companies that I don't think are very transparent. And I'm looking at everybody in that pipeline too, not just things like OpenAI, but all the different people that are using OpenAI. Like, I want to understand if you've got policies on this, if it's something that's in your kind of ethos of thinking, or if you're coming at it from more of the perspective, like I said, that I think is a little old paradigm, which is it's all about profit and saving as much money as possible, regardless of the impact. So I know for us, again, because I'm sort of I'm a sister company to a B Corp certified company, we've talked a lot as a whole group about the importance of really, as we're investing, that, even if we're investing a small amount of money compared to other businesses, that we really feel good about the companies we're investing with. And it's not about them being perfect, but it's about them being able to even have this conversation and then be present about these questions, right? We really want to see that. And we all really want to figure out different ways that we can plug in again to any policy opportunities that we have. So whether that's state, national, global, whether that's in your local town or city, I feel like that's always the low hanging fruit. So, and sometimes that is happening in our own organization, right? So just again, being willing to have those conversations. And then if you're in engineering at all, I love engineers. I'm not an engineer, but sometimes I feel like I wish somebody in my family had told me to go into that type of thing because I find it fascinating. I've learned so much from engineering people over the years. And so I've really appreciated that there is a whole movement with AI engineers around this issue. It's well talked about. This is an example where Zendesk, if you click on that link, they talk about their approach to this and how their engineers are looking at it. And these are kind of their 4 techniques right now for reducing the carbon footprint of what they're doing. And so I felt like this was just a good example of something in action that you can do, right? And that it's not about being perfect. Like, it's not about this is static. This is all they're going to do. This might be 8 things 2 years from now, right? Or the things that are on this list might change in a couple of years. And that's okay. I think we should consider most of our AI policies or approaches something that's actually shifting and changing as we go along. So the first question I wanted to ask as we're wrapping up, if you all don't mind providing some feedback, is just, I'm curious to see what people think about my opinion on this piece of it, right? That I feel like one of the things in technology that's kind of problematic is this old paradigm thinking where the cheapest, fastest, easiest option is like the best thing for business. But I'm realizing in a lot of cases in which that happens, it also feels like it ends up being the most exploitative choice. And so I've just been exploring in my own personal thinking and reading and exploring, what do I think needs to be in place, right? And how can they be implemented? I'm just wondering if anybody else has thought about this or has experienced something in that realm or just has something they want to share about it. And feel free to disagree. I don't expect everyone to have the same opinion. So you can be like, no, and say something totally different. I'm wide open to that.
No, I largely agree. One thing I've been thinking about though is when we say like the cheapest option is usually the most exploitative, 99% of the time I absolutely agree. What I've noticed with my company and like a lot of potential quote unquote uses of AI is we don't need to use AI in like a lot of cases. And so like it's actually cheaper to not use artificial intelligence because we don't need to procure, we don't need to like spend all this time training the models and then deal with all these ethical issues that we then like introduce by saying, oh, let's use generative AI. So in a lot of ways, like I've noticed that if we use simpler approaches or just like approach the problem from a like a non-techno deterministic lens, it's actually going to save us a little money as well as help us avoid some of these issues that we bring up. Now, in general, of course, yeah, like if the question is, oh, we think AI is going to give us more efficiency and we think it's going to be a band-aid and that's why we're doing it, then yeah, that's the cheapest quote unquote solution and going to cause a lot of harm. I just, the techno-determinism aspect of it is what frustrates me the most. Like the inevitability, the hype machine that pushes this like conversation of like, oh, we got to use AI. I think this is going to lead us down a path that we're going to continually just like fall into these traps. We need to focus more on the power aspect of it. Who's controlling these technologies? Who's designing these technologies? Who isn't? Who is being impacted the most? And like, I wish we could just focus more on like combating like austerity policies in government and like, things like that rather than, but anyway, sorry for the ramble, but.
No, not at all. I appreciate that so much, Cade, because I think that's a really important point. We do have a little bit of a hype problem. And being a social media expert over the last 20 years, I mean, that's something I watched happen in social media, right? Where like social media is not the answer for everything. Like I'm constantly teaching that in my own social media classes. Like there's lots of other ways you can accomplish what you want to accomplish. It just does not have to be Instagram. It might be Instagram, but we don't have to assume that it is. It's the same way I tell people you don't have to use every social media tool. And people are like, yeah, but everybody says I have to have all of them. And I'm like, you don't. I mean, you have to use something well and accomplish your goals, but you don't actually have to have 7 social media platforms necessarily, right? There's ways to still accomplish what you need to. So I really appreciate that because I think it's important always to remember that, we sometimes get caught up in that new thing, that new shiny thing. And especially when corporations know they can profit off of it, they spend a lot of money making it shiny. And so that's why I think it's important that you point that out. I think that's something the Center for Humane Technology, who I've been working my way through their classes over the last couple of years, I think that sort of technology determinism is something they talk a lot about for anybody who's interested in that. That's really about they speak from the perspective of technologists and people who are building these tools. And they often talk about how there's a whole new paradigm that they're trying to create to reframe how we approach these things. And I think that's like a core, bigger picture that you're tapping into. Anybody else have opinions or thoughts on that?
Well, and I think it's being touted as making your life easier. And so the general public loves things that makes their lives easier and simpler so they can go and do what they really want to do. And so I think that kind of creates another problem in that once the general public gets a hold of it because they think it's going to make their life easier, they're not going to see those bigger issues of what is the actual impact of this. To me, it's just a prompt on a screen without seeing all the layers behind it. And so, work smarter, not harder, is probably another piece to this. And some of the organizations and corporations and the conferences I've been to is, use this as a tool because it's here and it can help you rather than and make things easier for you. I think that's kind of the spin I've been hearing a lot without the thought of what's really behind it.
Yeah, I feel that way being a marketer for sure. It's like we can get caught up in all that stuff, and it's really exciting. I'm actually teaching a class for some of my students tomorrow where the class is literally titled, "Is AI actually saving you time?" Because we all decided that we were sold a lot of stuff on that level, but none of us actually feel like we're saving time yet. We all feel like we're learning new stuff, which is actually taking way more time. So anyway, or we're redoing our workflows. I think eventually there will be some time savings, but even that pitch is a little bit of that thing I'm talking about where, companies who can profit off of it are like really selling you this shiny thing. And then you're like, wait a second, this isn't doing exactly what we expected. What are you seeing, Alex? Or what are you guys thinking about at the city?
Yeah, I mean, super skeptical of the use cases, obviously, because of like the implications of AI hallucinations, or even like the effects that some of these sort of decision-making processes can have on marginalized groups and things like that. That's just like very scary to think about from a systematic standpoint. But some of the stuff that I've seen that I really like is this idea of like the human-centered design aspect to using this stuff. So just like approaching these systems, like you said, thinking about you want your technology to like look cool and be super interactive, but like, is it really that useful for what you're trying to make it? Can it be simpler, like you're saying? And yeah, just kind of right sizing it for the needs you have. But I definitely think that there should be regulation. I mean, for me, just in general, there should be more regulation around these companies. I think it's kind of like the game is set up for them to prosper in this way right now. So It's just we're no wonder they're taking advantage of that. And it was set up in a different way. Like you said, like in Asheville, we protect our natural resources because that is a big moneymaker for us. And when I went to Costa Rica, it's the same there. And where I'm from in like New England, like a lot of the nature is protected because that's how we make our money. So the regulations really play a big part in that.
Yeah, for sure. I spend time in Puerto Rico every year, and I think they're a really interesting story of how, this is a place with, I mean, I consider it the most beautiful place on planet Earth personally. But they were really abused by the United States in the beginning. We really harmed their natural beauty and resources and really poisoned some things, and then they were able to really say no to that and then bring that stuff back over the course of a few decades, which when you go there and see some of that stuff that's rejuvenated, it's like super powerful. But now, they have a lot of problems over there for different reasons. But I think it's kind of beautiful when you're there to see how really active the people who live on the island are around protecting their resources. And also because island nations are being hit so hard with climate change impact compared to the rest of us. So a lot of us are feeling climate change, but man, if you're living on an island, you're really feeling it. It's no joke. When you're like a tiny little pebble out in the ocean, you're sort of like one with the elements when you're over there. And so, that like experiencing all this like warming and the storms getting worse and the hurricane season extending super, super long now, where there's potential, for pretty scary storms, like more than 6 months of the year. All of that stuff I think is very relatable to what we go through here as well, where people are really wanting to protect that stuff at this point and have a say in what happens. But like I said, I feel like we're going to need sort of like mass focus and push up against those things. I do think it's fascinating right now that, Google just got convicted of being a monopoly, and they're the first on the list of big tech companies that the federal government here in the US is suing. Um, we've seen a lot of stuff in Europe going down with privacy and security around big tech. I think the AI privacy and security issues are kind of getting pulled into that conversation. So it is going to be fascinating to kind of see, because I feel like right now, I don't know if you all pay attention to like European elections. I was born in Europe and I happened to be in Italy during both the French and British elections recently. And, to me, it was just really fascinating kind of noticing like, like what's going on in the US and kind of a lot of the questions we're asking. There's all sorts of other countries asking the same questions and suing the same companies. And really, kind of there's this like sort of groundswell, I feel, of things coming together. And yet all of the elections that are going on are not that, like, at least in the Western world, which I will admit I'm not as familiar with some of the Eastern countries and what's happening in their elections. Like, I don't have as much detail, but at least across the Western world, as I'm watching some of those things, everybody's elections are crazy. Nobody knows who's getting into power. So nobody knows where we're going from the policy level. From a national sort of standpoint, those national issues make it even harder to, I think, have a more global conversation about it and think about any regulation from the global perspective. If we tag on two major wars and then some additional really difficult situations that are happening in countries that are pretty violent, I think that stuff doesn't bode well for us moving the dial on this stuff very quickly. So I am just encouraging people, to your point about Asheville, like, or mine about Puerto Rico, locally right now is sometimes the best place you can work, or statewide is sometimes the best place to plug in, because some of these other things are so wrapped up in other issues that we may not see that stuff develop. But if we can start to have those conversations locally, regionally, in our state, and say, what do we think about it? That's where I have followed California for a long time because as a state, they have taken pretty strong stances on privacy and security, different than the rest of our country. I see them taking other types of stances. So they're just a good example of like policy and action. And again, it's not always perfect. So in some ways, you're kind of watching somebody do something and you're like, like, could North Carolina use that? Or could Pennsylvania use that? Or, and how would we be able to implement it? Because chances are we can't implement it exactly the same because our governments are different. But we can at least sort of learn from each other and be sharing ideas, informations, outcomes. That's something I'd really like to see too in our country is, more just like transparency and sharing of what's happening state to state. We don't really have any unified way of seeing that. There's organizations that are trying to pull that stuff together. But I would love somewhere in the mix, for us to be able to cross-pollinate to see how we're doing things more clearly from a tech perspective. And I think that's, in these sessions, we've talked a lot about these big issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion, privacy and security, transparency. And I think, the more that we can look at how, again, that stuff's not new, we just haven't brought even our own country kind of together to say we have this understanding of the ecosystem. And so how can we build that out? I think it's going to be interesting over the next few months just to see a bunch of elections happen, a bunch of new people get into place. And then we're going to kind of know like where do we see we have traction on a regulatory discussion. And then we'll see these other lawsuits, although that'll take forever. And even Google's, I'm pretty sure they're appealing as we have this meeting. So we'll see if like what happened actually sticks. But at least we're, again, putting them in a position to have to think about it, which I think is really important. I also just want to say thanks, Cade. Cade dropped in a great resource, a paper. I'm going to add this to my slide deck so that we can all take a look at that. But yeah, just additional, information that I think would be super useful. So I really appreciate you adding that just from that bigger picture. Again, like how do we change the paradigm? But I know we're right at 12:55. The last thing we always do is I always just want everybody to think, I really want all of these things to give us a moment to think about stuff, to step away from the daily duties and just think about how we feel about it. And maybe, put a seed for ourselves about what is an action we can take, right? Whether that is exploring a tool that we really like and asking questions about it, or maybe in our next meeting with decision makers, sharing the slide deck that I send you all. I send you all a page that has all of our sessions with all of our slide decks. So I really want to encourage everyone, if you think that's something beneficial to give to people to explore, again, and just start conversations. I really believe it's important for people to plug in on the issues they care about. So it's hard to plug into the 9 issues that we're covering this year because it basically makes you feel like your brain is going to explode. But it's like maybe looking over those things and saying, oh, I want to learn more about this. I want to dig into this particular resource and understand what this organization is doing. Or maybe I want to ask questions about my state and what we're doing in that particular state and how, who's kind of taking leadership of those things. How can we connect with them? So again, hopefully, regardless of how small or simple it is, if you can just have one thing that you bring back to your organization, your business, or even to your friends and your colleagues, right, when you're talking to them, again, I think it opens up opportunity for people in the public to have a better awareness of what's happening. And, most of all for me, like I said, as a social media expert, I deeply love social media, but I've really watched us make so many mistakes. And I'm really trying to use whatever voice I have in the world to be like, let's not do that again. Let's make sure that we're caring about our communities and the people there and the flora and fauna there. And, that we're taking a holistic view so that I really believe AI has tremendous possibility when it's applied, as Cade said, with real intention and thought, and just not like thrown around as an automatic answer, but we really put our kind of like purpose behind it. So yeah, So thanks so much for being here and joining me for lunch. I really appreciate it. You can always reach out to me with any questions, but I'll send over the slide deck and the recording probably on Friday as usual. Sometimes I get it out Thursday. But yeah, thanks so much for being here. And Kate, I see your comment. You've been looking for some resources or tool to calculate carbon emissions of computing resources, just like daily internet activity. And you're going to look into that Google report. And you're also curious about what local efforts are happening in Nebraska. Yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciate you sharing that kind of like action item. Yeah, I will say Google, again, it's not like they're doing everything right, but I've always appreciated, I mean, literally for 20 years, you've had the ability to go look at their sustainability initiatives and how they run their data centers, where they're building them. That's actually kind of how I became obsessed with Google. I once discovered they were building like data centers in this desert, and I was like, what? And it was all solar, and I was like, what is this? It was probably like 2004, the first time I came across that, and I was just fascinated because as you mentioned, Rachel, I'd never seen that. I'd been studying Google, I'd never seen anything about that. So yeah, again, I'll put together the slide deck. It's got a bunch of great stuff in there. So otherwise, have a great day, and I hope I will see y'all in September.